Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, some big updates. It seems that what we've been talking about for a few weeks now, a couple weeks now, that there does seem to be a movement on the Trump side to try to decertify the past elections and, well, going forward to maybe decertify future elections if there's enough fraud to justify it. Seems to be something that has the Democrats very concerned right now. And well, I shouldn't say Democrats anymore because it's actually kind of bipartisan establishment right now, and the House of Representatives actually just passed an election law, not through technically yet, but they're trying to block such a scenario from taking place. And those of you who've been watching this for a bit now, I think can see the writing on the wall that, hey, maybe they're concerned that, well, what we've been talking about may in fact be true. Also, folks, there's some updates with Trump's special master that he's being kind of blocked from reviewing the classified documents. I say classified with the parentheses because the way they're framing it is not documents that are classified, but instead documents that have classified markings. And it's a very strange way to frame it because one of the arguments Trump has, for example, is the documents were not classified. Trump is saying the documents were declassified. And of course, if we're talking about if they're talking about classified documents, that would mean documents that had been declassified would no longer fall under that. But documents that are declassified sometimes still have classified markings, like it's still written classified, but it had been declassified. Thereby meaning that they can take documents that were in fact declassified but might still have those markings in their original state because these would presumably be the original documents. If it's hard to, I'll explain a bit more as we go into it. There's a bit of a funny play on words they're using right now, and I believe this is I believe intentionally or not, it's misleading the way they're doing it. I'll explain this. And also, folks, the Biden administration is launching its own new political purge. And I'll say right now, it's, in my opinion, not a display of strength. It's a display of weakness, I would say. A display of concern that they may be losing power. And taken as a whole with, again, the new changes they're making to election laws, making it harder to decertify elections and so on, does make it look like they're very afraid something might be happening that could make them lose power, that could disrupt the systems that be, let's say. It's going to be a great show today, folks. Stick around. Also, if you haven't watched our J6 documentary yet, The Real Story of January 6th, that's going to be free for the rest of September. September's almost over, so if you haven't seen it yet, go watch it. Again, those of you on YouTube, Rumble, you do not have to subscribe to watch it. We're making it totally free, totally open the rest of the month. Send it to your friends, send it to your family members. You only got a few days left, and then it's back behind the subscription wall. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first story for the day. Now, I want to start with some breaking news, actually, because a lot of people were texting me and messaging me, asking me what the heck is going on in China. Because I want to get into this because it's a question a lot of people had, and I want to address it. Now, there were some rumors going around on the internet and, well, elsewhere, some media covered it as well, saying there was a coup that took place in China. And there were rumors that Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, was even placed under house arrest. I want to address that because based on what I'm seeing, it does not look like that's the case. But I want to explain why that is. And I'm not writing it off entirely. I want to be clear on that. But I will say the evidence does not really fully back up what people are assuming. Now, Epoch Times had a story on this, and they said Xi's absence from public eye ahead of third-term bid sets rumors flying. Now, basically what happened was Xi Jinping went on some trips. He disappeared for a couple weeks. And people started thinking that maybe he had been, placed under house arrest or something like that. I'll say that something is definitely taking place in China right now. Without a doubt, something big is going down. For me, this is not so much a sign that Xi has been placed under house arrest, but more so that the CCP looks like it's gearing up for war. Let me explain this, and then I'll get into the main stories for the day. But I want to address this just as kind of a breaking news piece. Now, Epoch Times said this. It said, just over a week ago, Chinese leader Xi Jinping embarked on a 3-day trip to Central Asia to mark his sphere of influence. He has since been out of the public eye, skipping a high-level military meeting in the annual United Nations Assembly, with China only weeks away from the 20th National Congress, where Xi is set to pursue an unprecedented third term. A lot of people think he's walking the path to become chairman of the CCP, similar to the path that Mao Zedong walked, which would give him absolute power over the CCP, which I should note, despite popular belief, Xi Jinping does not have absolute power over the CCP just yet. He's trying to get it by consolidating power. But they're saying such absence has been long enough to attract attention from keen political watchers, with some speculating that Xi has been placed under house arrest. Now, further in, I won't read the whole thing, it says, such speculation also came as Chinese nationals noted mass flight cancellations across the country. Nearly 10,000 flights, almost 2/3 of those scheduled for the day, were called off on Saturday. So airlines grounded, shut down, 2/3 of them, close to. And that was the same day a key conference on national defense and military reform was convened in Beijing. Weibo, China's top social media platform, swiftly censored discussions around the flight cancellation, declaring them as rumors. They're not rumors. The flight cancellations happened, of course, but this is the CCP we're talking about. And Xi, who arrived back in China's capital on September 16th after meeting with Russia's Vladimir Putin at a regional summit in Central Asia, did not appear at the Beijing meeting but relayed instructions that the armed forces should focus on preparing for war. Similarly missing was Wei Fenghe, his hand-picked Chinese military general currently serving as the country's national defense minister. And it says further in, during the past week, 6 senior Chinese officials, including 2 former cabinet-level officials, were handed heavy sentences for corruption-related offenses, adding to a string of officials purged in Xi's anti-graft campaign. It's not really about corruption. It's more about political. It's faction infighting. He's been purging mainly members of the Jiang faction, Jiang Zemin's faction, who's the leader of the CCP 2 leaders ago. Now, he launched that shortly after taking office in late 2012, and it says, how would Xi have the capacity to punish them if he lost his grip on power? One of the individuals who spoke up with this, Zhang, not Jiang Zemin, Zhang, argued in a show on September 22nd. Now, what does this mean? And then I'll get into some of the news for the day, the main news for the day. Again, the rumor going around was that Xi was placed under house arrest. The evidence we're seeing does not support that. The evidence we're seeing, look, this is what happened. He missed a UN conference. He missed this big national defense conference. Missing alongside of him was his top official in charge of defense, this top general, and he met with Vladimir Putin, and then after coming back to China, told people to prepare for war. Now, it's interesting that his top general, who would be the one who would basically be assigned on such a call to war, also was missing at the same time, and Xi comes back and says, prepare for war. Now, the narrative of how people think he got arrested is, I mean, you never know with China. Maybe he was placed under house arrest. It looks more to me like Xi Jinping was engaging in secret meetings around national defense and maybe even a possible war with Taiwan, possibly. It looks like the Chinese Communist Party is, in fact, preparing for war, and Xi Jinping is saying that. Now, I should say that with a caveat that, of course, Xi Jinping has been talking about waging war for quite a while, as have a lot of these countries. But basically, this is the global situation right now. Iran has large-scale anti-government protests taking place. The Iranian regime right now is really coming closer to possible collapse. I say possible because they've undergone similar protests and they just crushed them and things ended. But right now you have bus loads of soldiers and police, rocks thrown at them. They won't even stop to confront the protesters. Russia right now, they of course made a new draft to conscript a whole bunch of people. They're giving them, like, literally World War II Mosin Nuggets, and, these old bolt-action rifles and so on, like really old rifles, and totally rusted AK-47s, Kalashnikovs. They're conscripting people, and people are also trying to mass leave Russia. The flight cancellations in China, I think maybe don't suggest so much that people may be trying to flee China as they're trying to flee Russia right now ahead of the conscriptions. But it is very telling that they were trying to prevent some people from leaving the country for some unknown reason. Now, what could that possibly mean? It could mean the Chinese Communist Party may want to institute a draft similar to what Russia just did. It could mean that Xi Jinping is looking to purge more rival party members, which would be why he would have interest in grounding the flights, especially leading up to the new Congress they're going to be having, where Xi Jinping is expected to win a third term, and based on everything available right now and information, it does look like Xi Jinping is going to win a third term, which is unprecedented in China. In other words, it looks like they're preparing for something very large right now. And if you understand the state of the Chinese Communist Party, it makes sense. The CCP, I mentioned really ahead of the pandemic. Those of you watching the show at the time, I was saying the CCP looks like it's going to collapse. Some of you asked how long. I said, well, probably doesn't have more than a year or two left. That was, of course, before the pandemic. Right at the cusp of the pandemic, several major incidents took place. You had, of course, the mass protests in Hong Kong. The CCP, again, intervened and ended Hong Kong's democracy, something that a lot of people never saw coming. Because for the CCP, they need Hong Kong as a way to launder money. Of course, the U.S. didn't properly sanction those money laundering mills, which was actually kind of surprising. At the same time, the CCP was afraid those protests would spread into mainland China, and they did spread into Taiwan to an extent. Of course, Taiwan is not under the CCP. And so, basically the party that opposes the Chinese Communist Party won by a landslide in Taiwan, ending any possibility the CCP could have peacefully taken over Taiwan through the political process. At the same time, the economy in China was starting to collapse. You had a lot of disasters. Really, things were not looking hot for the CCP. Internal discussions within the CCP that I reported on at the time said that top-level leaders wanted to basically shut down China. They wanted to shut down the country, redo the Cultural Revolution, reestablish the authority and power of the Chinese Communist Party, even if it meant, losing half the population or something like that. They wanted the survival of the party was at stake. And basically, things happened as they did. Trump lost the election. There was some Chinese involvement in that. For example, with some of the groups that were doing the election maps. Also, the CCP spread the economic crisis that China was facing to the entire world using COVID. By doing so, then they declared externally, outside of China, that it's now time to invest in China because they're about to bounce back or build back. And Wall Street, BlackRock, all these big investment firms just poured money into the Chinese Communist Party. Really temporarily propping up the collapsing economic system, especially the housing market, which is roughly a third of their GDP. And keep in mind the export economy is another third. Both the housing market and the export economy, because of COVID, are about to collapse. Where we're at now with the CCP is that nothing is being shown to be able to save these dying industries. The economy is on the brink of collapse. The CCP is having a lot of infighting. Social stability is at stake, which is a lot of people believe, including myself, believe is why they're maintaining the lockdowns, because the lockdowns are a way of maintaining social stability. To prevent people from gathering on the streets and protesting, and they're even using the COVID health passes as ways to throw prisoners in jail, to make them, again, because they've been doing it, where if people go protest, they turn their health codes red and they say, COVID alert, and they throw them in the gulag. It's mostly house arrest unless they violate it. Nothing right now is demonstrating an ability to maintain the CCP. And in a situation like that, there's two possibilities. One is the CCP is just going to collapse, or two, they're going to launch a war. And by launching a war, make a last-ditch effort, the kind of last option, which, if you understand Chinese military thought, war would be the final stage when everything else has failed. The last-ditch effort they have to try to save the regime. I would not put it beyond them at this time. And based on current information coming out from China, I think it's more likely that they are in fact preparing for war, and that we're past the stage of them just paying lip service to it. That's how I'm reading this, at least. Now, folks, I'm going to go into what's happening now with, of course, the efforts to try to prevent a decertification of the American elections. But I wanted to kind of give my take on what on the news that's been going around about Xi Jinping, because I think a lot of you wanted to hear it. Again, a lot of people were messaging me about it, and I want to do something on that. Folks, before we go on, we do have a sponsor today. Today's episode is brought to you by Secure. Now, over 155 million Americans are affected by data leaks in 2020. The average American had their personal data stolen about 4 times over the year. People get anxious because they can't protect their online data or their online activity. But now there's a new email and messenger app called Secure. That's Secure. That gives privacy and security for sending emails and messages. Secure servers and data centers are hosted in Switzerland, which has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. It also does not rely on big tech companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, which also means it's not subject to the Intrusive Cloud Act. Now, Secure does not ask for your phone number, mine your data, or upload your contacts. So you can add people you know, or you can also send them an invite. Secure protects you from hackers getting onto your phone. You also have privacy while you're on the app. Now, it's $5 for the messenger, $7 for the email, or $10 for the email and messenger package. You can visit secure.com today for a free 7-day trial, or you can use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring today's episode. All right, folks, that said, I want to go into what's happening with this whole issue of decertifying elections. Now, I want to give a bit of my take on this. So, again, some of you a few weeks ago, asked me, is it possible that Trump could come back into office before 2024? I kind of said, I don't think so. I don't think Trump could come back in. But, maybe he could, of course, back people who win the midterms, and that would set the stage for him coming back in. I mentioned, and I did a few episodes going really in depth on this, that my understanding of this has actually changed. In fact, I do think that Trump is in fact looking to, put people into office through the midterms who will in fact decertify the elections, the 2020 elections in several states. By doing so, pushing the electoral college vote threshold below 270 votes for Biden, and thereby triggering a contingency election. Now, I won't go into everything because I did like a couple 2-hour-long episodes on it a couple weeks ago. So if you want to watch those, watch my episodes on that. Again, on decertifying the elections. But I mentioned also the Supreme Court is looking to make a ruling on this as well, which would, not on this specifically, but that would clear the way for it. Basically making it so these state legislatures are the ones in charge of the elections. If the state legislatures are the ones in charge of elections, then if you have a scenario like we did in 2020, where the state legislature appoints dueling electors as opposed to the ones appointed by the courts and the governors of each state, then those dueling electors would be the official ones if the state legislature is the authority on the elections. Now, what it's not Democrats, actually. What the establishment has done, because this is technically bipartisan now. Bipartisan establishment party, right? The House of Representatives has passed a bill that would make it very difficult to decertify an election, thereby, I think, damaging the potential, well, not fully, I think there's still a good window for it, but making it more difficult, let's say, to have such a scenario to take place. And I found this very interesting because, again, as we recently take a look at Biden's red speech, where Biden in his speech was claiming that, that there was a movement to try to decertify the 2020 elections. He was, of course, blaming that on Trump and MAGA Republicans. Mo Brooks talked about this. There are people blowing the whistle on the Democrat side, or to the Democrats, claiming that Trump is part of his endorsements for the midterm elections, right? Backing Republicans for the midterm elections. That as part of that, Trump was asking them, according to accusations, asking them to decertify the elections in their respective states. All the evidence does appear to be lining up, that this is in fact what at least Trump is being accused of trying to do. And the Democrats and the establishment in general, mostly Democrats, but a few Republicans, right? They're actually taking steps now. They're taking real steps to try to stop this from taking place, leading me to believe that either, frankly, the Democrats and some establishment Republicans are really paranoid, or that it might be true, or maybe a bit of both. Let me go over this. So Epoch Times had this story. It said, House, that's the House of Representatives, passes election bill that makes it harder to decertify presidential results. And again, read this. When I read this, I won't go over the whole thing, but take this in context of what we've been talking about, right? Take this in context of what we've been discussing. It says the House of Representatives on September 21st passed an election law bill designed to address President Donald Trump's legal efforts to decertify some electoral states in 2021. That's, again, the last election, 2020 and 2021. The bill, dubbed the Presidential Election Reform Act, passed in a mostly party-line vote with a handful of GOP defections. Some Republicans voted with them. The final vote, coming in at 229 to 203, included support of 221 Democrats and 9 Republicans. During the aftermath of the 2020 election, when Trump was trying to determine how to move forward on his claims of widespread election fraud, lawyer John Eastman was among the attorneys in Trump's inner circle who supported an effort to refuse to certify electoral states where states had concerns of election fraud where that was most prevalent. Eastman's position that Vice President Mike Pence had the power under the 12th Amendment to reject some electoral states was heavily taken to by Trump, who tried to convince Pence to refuse to certify some electoral states. Specifically, the effort centered on an ambiguous line in the 12th Amendment passed after the near crisis of the election of 1800, which saw Congress go through dozens of ballots before finally declaring Thomas Jefferson the winner. That line reads, "The President of the Senate, i.e. the Vice President, shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates that the votes shall then be counted." Eastman proposed that Pence could legally refuse to count the ballots of states deemed most at risk of election fraud. Because remember, you had 7 states. There were 7 states in the 2020 elections that submitted dueling electors, which under the Constitution should have been the official ones, because technically, if you read the Constitution, the state legislature would be the ones in charge of the election. And in fact, even a lot of the bypassing of the state legislature to change election laws should have been deemed illegal and invalid. But again, the Supreme Court's going to be ruling on that soon. Now it says this: in addition to naming the vice president's role in electoral certification a ceremonial one, which is what the Democrats are trying to do right now, the Democrats and some establishment Republicans, they're trying to make it so, in other words, that Pence would not have had that authority. Now, remember, Pence claimed he did not have that authority, but frankly, if Pence did not have the authority, then why would Congress need to change the laws to make it so that he wouldn't, right? Doesn't line up. It says the bill would up the numbers of lawmakers needed to sustain an objection to a state's reported electoral state. So that's how they're doing it. They're making it so that if a state legislature wanted to decertify an election and put forward dueling electors, that they would have to get more of the local state legislature behind it than they did last time. Remember that, again, you had 7 states in 2021 technically, submit dueling electors. 7 states. which meant that had those votes been counted, Trump would have won by a landslide in terms of the Electoral College. Now, if again things turn around and let's say the Trump's backed politicians get into power come the midterms, those 7 states could technically decertify the elections, thereby triggering a contingency election. What the Democrats and some not many, but some Republicans are doing in the House right now, these establishment Republicans, is they're making it so that the threshold of the number of people you would need, in terms of the state legislature to decertify an election would be higher. Meaning that Trump's plan for this, if this bill passes the Senate, would be very difficult. I find it interesting they're doing this because, frankly, it adds a lot of credibility to what I've been suspecting is in fact taking place. Because they're trying to block what I've been suspecting is in fact taking place, which is, again, that Trump is encouraging people to decertify the 2020 elections, thereby triggering a contingency election, and through that, try to become president again before 2024. Now it says, House Administration Committee, and again, maybe they're not doing that, but Democrats seem to believe he's doing that, which is why they're passing bills to prevent such a scenario. Right? Now it says further in, House Administration Committee ranking member Rodney Davis, a Republican, said that the bill is opening the door to mass litigation, lawsuits. In addition, Davis argued that the legislation tramples state sovereignty over election laws, suggesting that, in other words, what the federal government, what the House of Representatives, because this is not past the Senate yet, but what the House of Representatives is doing with this may not even be legal, because the federal government does not run the elections. The states run the elections, which is why, again, under the Constitution, the state legislature is in charge of that, not the federal government. But of course, that would need to be litigated. You would need to sue and go through the whole process, and probably the Supreme Court would have to rule on it and then overturn it. States don't have to follow the federal government on this, in other words. But if it's a presidential election, and again, Congress, i.e. the Democrat-held Congress, and then it would be Vice President Kamala Harris, thereby in the role of Pence, who would be counting the Electoral College votes. If the Democrats control the system at the federal level, they could easily just say, we're not going to listen to the states, we're going to listen to the federal government, because this is what, again, the House and Senate agreed upon, and we passed a federal law. In other words, even though it may not be legal what they're doing may not be legal at the federal level. They control things at the federal level, and because they control things at the federal level, especially because Kamala Harris would be the one counting the Electoral College votes in such a scenario, they could try to, again, just claim that the illegal laws are valid. The exception to that would, of course, be if the Supreme Court rules on this, which, even if they pass this before the Supreme Court ruling, it is possible the Supreme Court could add in its clarification something that would encompass this, handing the authority solely to the state legislatures and eliminating the role that the federal government is trying to play on it. In other words, even if they pass this, it may not fully hold up, but what the Democrats are doing by pushing this and bypassing this is creating a legal battleground where these things are going to have to be argued and litigated, again, as ranking member Rodney Davis is suggesting. Now, more on this. I'm going to cover this a bit more. It says in an interview with the Epoch Times, John Eastman, the Trump attorney who was most supportive of the 12th Amendment scheme, Trump's plan, disagreed about the legality of the effort. He noted that the Constitution gives states the power to make their own election laws and determine the manner in which states will choose their electoral slates. In other words, what the House is doing right now very likely violates the Constitution. Very likely the Democrats are violating the Constitution by even trying to pass this law. And it says, in every U.S. state at this point, the popular vote is the method of choosing this slate. But Eastman also pointed to several last-minute changes by secretaries of states, executive orders from governors, and county clerks that changed or overshot the statutory required legislature-approved legal regulations like deadlines and signature verification. And he said those election codes were violated. There's no dispute about that. That means the election was not constitutionally conducted. How big the impact was is hard to say. He said it was rather extraordinary, the illegality of it. What he's saying, in other words, is that by bypassing the state legislature, by having county clerks and by having governors and so on change election laws that, again, did not follow the legal process in the 2020 elections, that those states, in fact, violated the law. And by changing the election laws, which cleared the way to widespread fraud, they flagrantly violated U.S. law. And because the state legislature was left out of it, the state legislature was valid in their stance of choosing to put forward dueling electors. And again, were the same thing to happen come 2024, or for example, or even before that, the state legislature could have the authority now, if, again, and this is going to be where the battleground is, the state legislature will have the authority, very likely, especially after the Supreme Court ruling, and especially after they probably get more votes come 2022, with more conservative representatives through the midterms. They will have the authority to decertify based on their observance that the laws were violated and that they were left out of the process. There's a real ground for them to decertify. And I would say that very likely they will try to do it. Now, what the Democrats have done is made a legal barrier that will make it more difficult for them to do that. It doesn't mean they cannot do it, but it will be more difficult for them to do it. Now, I should note this has not yet passed the Senate, but given the way the Democrats are operating, it is possible they could. Now, if, for example, every Democrat votes for this and every Republican in the Senate votes against it, Democrats could technically still, just get rid of the filibuster and then pass it, which they might do. They have done it. Or it's also possible that you might get some defectors from the Democrat side who say, no, I'm going to follow the Constitution, and this bill is in fact unconstitutional. It could go either way right now. Regardless, though, it does seem to be the case that what we've been discussing now for a few weeks is, at the very least, a real concern for the Democrats, whether this is in fact what Trump is trying to do. But I do think the evidence backs that this is what Trump is in fact trying to do. Last part on this, and we'll jump over to Epic TV. It says the use of the 12th Amendment in the vice president's role, Eastman argued, was a last resort, albeit a legal one, stemming from the unwillingness of courts to consider the legal issues involved and the unwillingness of governors to call legislatures into special sessions to address the concerns. And Eastman further argued the electoral process was designed in large part to ensure that Congress does not have the final say in choosing the president, such a system would destroy the separation of powers. Interesting times we're in, folks. Now, I want to go into what's happening with Trump and his special master, and then a few other things as well. Before we do that, though, let's jump over exclusively to Epic TV. But I had a recent interview with Peter Navarro, and it was very interesting, especially for anyone wondering what was happening behind the scenes in the Trump White House. Peter Navarro, I met with him in Washington, D.C. He gave a really interesting take, not just on what was happening behind the scenes, and there's some exclusive stuff in here, where Navarro is even saying that there were, for example, people who were in charge of, transporting Trump's communications, who were taking Trump's communications and throwing them in the trash. Trump was being, let's say, inhibited to that degree, where even his executive orders were being tossed out by people in charge of moving documents. It's a very telling interview on what took place in Trump's White House, and also on one of Trump's key mistakes, according to Navarro. Trump's key mistake, according to Navarro, was that Trump tried to work with the establishment. And he says that Trump, through seeing these mistakes, has taken some lessons, and next time around he does not plan to do that. It's very interesting. I highly recommend watching it for anyone wondering what took place. But let me show you a trailer of that, then we'll jump over.
The day after the election, a decision got made. Steve Bannon calls it the original sin of the first term of the Trump administration. That decision was to invite the Rhino Republicans into the Trump tent.
President Donald Trump made a key mistake while in office by trusting members of the establishment who ultimately betrayed him. The former president now understands this as he prepares to retake the White House.
That set in motion, particularly in the early part of the administration, a set of really bad choices.
We speak with Navarro, former Trump advisor and author of the book, Taking Back Trump's America. We kind of watched one by one people betray him.
Having him in charge, I had to fight him every single day, and I was assured that had been given to the president, was never given. That could have changed history right there.
Yeah, folks, again, that's our interview with Peter Navarro. Be sure to check it out. Some really, really interesting information in there. All right, that said, let's jump over to Epic TV real quick, folks. If you're on YouTube, Rumble, the documentary, The Real Story of January 6th, is free for the rest of September. If you haven't seen it yet, you don't want to subscribe, I get it. Watch it now because it's free. And also, if you want to send it to a friend or family member, do it now because it's only free for the rest of September. All right, folks, that says jump over to Epic TV. We'll see you there. All right, folks. Thank you all for being here. Those of you curious also, I have Taiwanese oolong